I am a neoliberal. And that should really end the discussion or end the debate in terms of nationalism versus globalism. Or what I want to get into here is the debate of psychological types, not of ideologies, but of types between the Joker and the neoliberal. I believe that we can associate in some senses the Joker with the masculine. Joker wants to break down society. He wants to eliminate the system. He wants to be a criminal. He wants to go outside the law. He doesn't want to be constrained. He doesn't want to be trapped. He doesn't want to be in the rat race. He doesn't want to be in the wheel of the chipmunk or the ferret. What are those little animals called? The little rats and mice. He doesn't want to be that. He doesn't want to be domesticated. So he's rebellious. And he fetishizes his own rebellion as proof of his masculinity. Whereas the neoliberal in some ways is feminine. The neoliberal accepts what is and works within the system. The neoliberal even defends the system. You could even say the neoliberal is a reactionary. The neoliberal is reacting to threats against the system and trying to justify the system. The default position of the neoliberal is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if you say that the system is broke, that's a threat to the system. And you're the problem, not the system itself. So I view these as two psychological types. And if I have to adopt the moniker of neoliberal, then I'll do so. I don't have an interest in proving the purity of my rebelliousness. I don't have an interest in proving the purity of my nationalism. I don't have an interest in proving the purity of my Christianity. I would rather say, okay, fine. I am not a Christian. I'm not a nationalist. I'm not a joker. I'm a neoliberal. But there's still some things that we can look at. If you haven't already turned off the stream, if you haven't already decided that I am a heretic, that I am the divine feminine, the Cthulhu, the Chthonian, the what other archetypes could we bring up in reference to this? There's the Hottentot figure, right? That Marduk slays the female Tiamat, the female dragon Tiamat, Marduk in an act of rebellion against nature. He slays Tiamat. And so in the Babylonian myth, in Indo-European myth, there is not just patricide, as I've mentioned before, but there's also matricide. There's the killing of the earth goddess, the killing of the feminine, the conquering of the feminine by the masculine. And in some ways, that's what science represents. That's what the Joker represents. He represents this rebelling and the conquering of the feminine status quo by the investigative, by the revolutionary spirit. And that's where we ultimately get science from. It is this will to power. There is a Nietzscheanism to it. That is where science comes from. Science doesn't just come from pure rationality, pure reasonableness, pure facts and logic. There's actually an animating will and desire. Because science is difficult. Science isn't just a result of being logical and reasonable. I think if we are purely logical and reasonable and we have no will to power, no will to science, no will to rebel against the status quo, then the result is that we would be Buddhists, right? I think Buddhism is the most logical, rational, reasonable system if you do not have the will to progress. And there has to be, referring to teleologies here, there has to be a concept of the linear. The masculine and the linear, as Camille Paglia notes in her History of Art and Sexual Personae, the linear is intimately connected with the masculine and the Apollonian. That in order to truly believe in the masculine, to truly believe in the concept of rebellion against the status quo, we have to believe that we're going from point A to point B to point C, not that we're going from point A to point B and back again to point A. If we have a cyclical view of history, then that is ultimately a feminine view of history. That is ultimately a view of history that there's nothing that we can accomplish outside of the system. That the universe is, in a Parmenidean sense, it is static. That all of the dynamics inside of it are an illusion, and that ultimately it is oscillating up and down. And we can believe that we're part of a linearity within that system. When you're at the bottom of an oscillation, as you go up to the top, you believe that there's a linear progression from A to B. And as you go from the top to the bottom, you believe there's a linear progression from B to A. But you zoom out from the whole system and you see it's just going A, B, A, B. And it's not actually a linear system, it's a cyclical system. But in order for change to happen, in order for power to be won, and in order to maintain power, there has to be a sense of the linearity of history, that you have to have this faith and this belief that I can change things. If you believe that your efforts ultimately are muted by the immutability of universal dynamics and cycles, then you're never going to have the will to change the system. If you just want to keep everything the same, or if not even that you want to keep things the same, but simply you perceive the world as ultimately outside of your control, that the world is composed of factors that you do not have agency over, then that is going to stymie whatever will to change you might have had, and it's going to give you a desire to reconcile with the system as it is, to fit yourself into the system as it is. When we look at, there's two sort of ethics when a tribe is conquered. There's the masculine ethic, which the Jews showed at Masada, where the Romans had surrounded them on top of this plateau in Israel. And they were, instead of surrender to the Roman system, worship Jupiter, all of that, they decided to all commit suicide. That is the masculine ethic. We actually see that in the myth of the rape of Lucretia, that Lucretia, the Roman noblewoman, decides to kill herself rather than join the Etruscans. So in all of these examples, we're seeing the contrast, or we're seeing here the masculine. The feminine strategy is you get conquered by the tribe, you accept the new tribe, you submit to the new tribe, and you, rather than trying to change the external system to be in accordance with your will, you change your will to be in accordance with the system. So these, broadly speaking, are the two options, the two psychological types. Again, what people will do is they will fetishize one or the other in accordance with their moral beliefs. So people who believe in the supremacy of the hypermasculine, they're always trying to prove their masculinity. They'll say, I'm more of a joker than you. I'm more of a rebel than you. I can put my middle finger up even higher and stronger and in a more violent way. And I can be even more destructive, and I can be even more willful. And so it's sort of a signal to other people and to oneself, proving to oneself, yes, I am masculine because I am acting, my behaviors are in accordance with the masculine. But it can also happen with the feminine, right? You can have what I guess we derisively term cat ladies or church ladies, people who believe that it is good to be loyal to the system. It is good to be loyal to my husband. It is good to be loyal to the state, to the church. It is good to be patriotic. It is good to be loyal to the government. It's good to be loyal to the tribe. It's good, whatever forms of loyalty and conformity. Often we describe collectivistic societies where this is a very strong moral urge. Sweden, it could be an example in certain cases. China can be an example where actually the joker is constantly stamped out. He's the sore thumb. He is the nail which must be hammered down. So there is a collectivistic moral ethic which says, do not rebel. Rebellion is deviant. Rebellion is devilish. Rebellion is demonic and has to be crushed in favor of conformity toward the system. Now, whether the system is actually right or just or good or efficient or any of those things doesn't really matter to the feminine moralist. And for the masculine moralist, it doesn't really matter if all of his linear projections and pronouncements and declarations actually have any basis in reality at all. So when we've heard a famous speech, which it's like, look, if let's say theoretically I was put in a very stressful situation, might I start screaming ridiculous things, I might start doing that. So it's not even a personal judgment to bring up this speech, but when we hear somebody say something like, I rule, I win, people like me rule over people like you, I think most people have heard that kind of sentiment before. And that is a representation of the Joker type, the masculine moralism, which is that despite the odds, despite the realities, despite the externalities around me, I'm simply going to project my masculinity. I believe and I have faith more in my conquering spirit than I do in the realities of everyday life. So when someone goes out there and says, I'm the king and I rule over you and I'm the best, and that kind of arrogance, it's not just a passive mistake. It's not simply a mistakenness. It is not actually accidental delusion, but it is purposeful and active delusion. It is an active delusion that is willful and says, it is not simply a question of morale, right? Sometimes people will use these two terms, morale and defeatism, that if you suggest that a certain strategy is flawed or a certain strategy can't work or won't work, that's described as defeatist. Whereas if you believe in yourself and you trust yourself and you have faith in yourself, that's called having high morale and being optimistic. And so the argument's made, and this is true, that in order to fully make all of the sacrifices, in order to fully express your potential, in order to have the best chance of success, you have to believe in yourself. If you have any doubts whatsoever, you will ultimately self-sabotage because you're going to be hedging your bets. And if you hedge your bets, then you're not putting 100% into your strategy. If you're not putting 100% into your strategy, then theoretically, you might not reach a threshold that you otherwise might. For example, let's say you have a tribe of people and they're hunting this herd of bison or buffalo, and they've lost track of the herd, and they're trying to figure out which direction to go, north, south, east, or west, and many multitude of other directions. And they are looking at this situation, they are looking at this problem, and they're saying, well, we could go north, we could go south, we could go east, we could go west. And let's say there's 200 members in the tribe, 100 of those are men, 50 of those are fighting age men. It's a pretty large tribe of buffalo, and they're going to need all the men that they can. And let's say of those 50 men, 10 of them are really expert hunters, 10 of them are really going to be the core of the hunting party, and they have to decide which direction they should go. If they all go north and they don't find any bison, they will die. If they all go south and they don't find any, they'll die. If they go east or west, and that's not the direction the bison were in, they're going to die. But let's look at the other situation where they say, let's split up the tribe. Let's split up into 4 different directions, the north, south, east, west. We're going to divide the tribe into little bands of 50. Now, within that 50, there's 25 men. Within that group of 25 men, maybe only 2.5 on average are expert hunters. So between 2 and 3 are going to be these expert hunters. Now, with 2 or 3 men, you can't bring down the tribe of bison. You can't accomplish the objective. And so essentially, you've reduced your chances of victory from 1 out of 4, where you say, okay, we're either going to go north, south, east, or west. 75% of the time, we're going to totally fail and die, but there's 25% chance that we are going to find that herd of bison and we're going to kill them and we're going to eat and we're going to survive. Whereas if you break up the tribe into 4 different directions and you say, we're going to have, again, 50, 50, 50, and 2 to 3 good hunters in each of those groups, and you go north, south, east, west, then you've got a 0% chance of victory. So putting all your eggs in one basket and committing to a certain strategy, there are examples where that is necessary. And so what would the feminine morality say? The feminine morality would say something like, well, maybe we shouldn't go anywhere. If we can't decide where to go, maybe we should just stay put. Maybe we should just try to gather berries or pray to God or hope the bison come to us. That would be the passive mode. But the active mode who says this is right, this is the right way, this is the way we have to do things, that's really, in that scenario I've laid out for you, that's the only chance that the tribe has for survival. So the reason why the Joker type exists in the divine masculine, or not the divine masculine, maybe that's an associated concept, but masculine morality exists ultimately because it has a function to it. It has a historical function. There are periods where that is truly necessary in hours of decision. Then that comes to the forefront as the only solution to certain problems. However, you have other situations where actually it's not the case that if you only have 2 to 3 hunters, you can't take down any bison. Let's draw up another scenario where pretty much the same as I've already described, but let's say the tribe of bison or the herd of bison has about 50 bison in it. And if you only have 2 or 3 hunters, you can bring down, let's say each hunter can kill 1 bison. So if you have all the hunters in one group and they all go north, you've got your 10 hunters and they can kill 10 bison, and then the tribe can survive off those 10 bison. Whereas if you split the tribe up into north, south, east, and west, and you send 2 to 3 hunters north, 2 to 3 hunters south, 2 to 3 hunters east, 2 to 3 hunters west, well, one of those hunting groups is going to find the bison. They're not going to be able to kill all 10, but they can kill 10 or 3, or 2 or 3. So now you've shifted from a situation. This is really about game theory now. This is about, we're sort of getting the classic is the prisoner's dilemma, but so we're basically talking broadly about game theory. Now, if you split the group up, you have a 100% chance of getting 2 to 3 bison, as opposed to the masculine moral behavior would be we have to send the entire tribe in one direction, and in that case, you've got a 25% chance of getting lots of bison, 10 bison, but a 75% chance of getting 0 bison. So here we're seeing basically the gambler's strategy versus the hedging your bets, going all in, whether investing it's Bitcoin, whether you're going into the stock market, whatever you're doing, whatever your strategy is, versus a diversified portfolio. The interesting thing about the actual way that investment works is that generally people do have a diversified portfolio to reduce risk. However, a lot of the people who become very wealthy become wealthy not because of their diversified portfolio, but because they went all in on a certain investment. So Mark Zuckerberg, his life is Facebook. He went all in on Facebook. He's become rich. Bill Gates went all in on Microsoft. I always forget the 2 individuals who started Google. They went all in on Google. Steve Jobs went all in on Apple. So people who become fantastically rich, they have to commit themselves fully to a project and hope that project works. There are a lot of people who commit themselves fully to a project and it doesn't work. And that's essentially what the lottery is. A lot of people buy tickets, most people lose money, and there's one lucky winner. And that one lucky winner wins out. That's how it appears to us. But I think actually when we look at these big gambling or lottery winners, these rich people, I don't think it's entirely accidental. I think there's a lot more background that goes into it than we would first perceive. So I think Facebook in many ways is a government project. Apple, Microsoft. I don't think that these corporations have become quangos or quasi-non-NGOs. Not non-NGOs, but quasi-NGOs. I don't think they've become quangos. I think they started as quangos. In the same way, the internet did not start as a free market project. It started as a government project. And so in order to start a government project, whether it's a social media company, a tech company, the internet in general, whatever you're starting, a government project isn't just purely about luck, but there's an element of networking that goes into that. There's an element of understanding your environment and understanding what are the opportunities, what is possible. That, I think, is what allows these individuals and these corporations to actually take off, is because they're able to synthesize certain interests and to fulfill a need that had existed previously. So the ability to judge the environment and to invest in a project really has more to do with networking. When we look at the other side of how are rich people rich, we look at what Jeff Bezos did recently when he dumped a bunch of stock prior to the recent crash. Now, how is he able to do that? Well, he's networked in with, first of all, he owns, I guess, his own newspaper or media company. What is it? Is it Wall Street Journal, Wall Street Post? I forget which one he owns. But anyway, he's connected in with essentially an intelligence agency. That's what a journalistic enterprise is. It's about gathering intelligence in one way or another. So he's connected in exoterically with an intelligence agency. I don't know who he's talking to behind the scenes, but we saw that in the government as well. Certain senators dumped their stock prior to the recent crash. And so that's about networking as well. It's not about taking a risk or doing something randomly or doing something off a hunch or doing something off of some kind of charismatic schizophrenia, but it's about being networked in with the government, with intelligence agencies, and then being able to make intelligent decisions based off that information, whether it's supplying a need in the form of a social media company, a technology company, or whether it's the reverse, which is shorting the market essentially, or dumping your stock and thus preserving your funds. There's an interesting graph which basically shows growth over time in the stock. It looks at the Dow Jones versus inflation. Basically, when you go back to the 1940s, the Dow Jones was rising until about the late 60s, so 1966, 1969. Then it began to drop again until the 80s. So there was, throughout the 70s, it was basically a decade of decline economically with respect to inflation. And then during the 80s with Reagan, you started to see economic growth again. We started winning the Cold War. We started getting serious about that. And then this rises up until about 1999, and then you have the crash of the dot-com bubble, and then things rise again through the Bush years, and then you have the crash of 2007, 2008, 2009, into 2010, and then it rises again through the second term of Obama, and through the Trump years, the last 4 years of Trump, and now it's crashed again. And so if you look at each of those ups and downs, and you look at the downs where the market returns to the baseline of the market with respect to inflation, the Dow Jones is exactly where it was in 1966 to 1969. We have not really changed very much in terms of where the Dow Jones is with respect to inflation. All we've done is we've inflated the currency. So that's the total market, and that's why real wages haven't risen in the last 60 years or so. But interesting point is, if you're like Jeff Bezos, and every time the market's about to crash, you dump all your stock and you put it in something that has real value. Whether that's a fiat currency when we talk about real value, that's a comparative term, that's a relativistic term. So Jeff has dumped his money into US dollars. Then you can dump your money into rural land. You can dump it into gold mining, companies, or you can dump it into real assets. Some people are going to dump it into Bitcoin. Even governments are buying up Bitcoin. So there's a lot of things to shift your money out of the market into something else that's going to retain its value better during a recession or depression, and also it's going to retain its value better during an inflation of the currency, which we're currently seeing. I think U.S. currency within the last few months or so, or few weeks, has inflated 4%, which is incredible. If you have your wealth in physical dollars right now, you are losing money. You are losing money because the value of your money is decreasing with respect to other hard assets like rural land, like gold, like Bitcoin. Again, I'm using this term hard in a relativistic way. There are all types of scenarios where we can say, well, you own land and then a flood came and now your land's underwater. It's not a very hard asset now. Or you can say things like, well, you own gold, but then someone came and stole your gold. Or there's a crisis, there's a collapse of civilization. How much is your gold worth if, we're back to anarcho-primitivism? Or you can say Bitcoin, you call that a hard asset. Well, what if the internet shuts down, or computers, that we have an EMP? So there's all kinds of scenarios where assets that are relatively hard compared to the soft fiat currency, the malleable, inflatable fiat currency, There are all kinds of scenarios where you can say, well, it's not ultimately hard. Ultimately, there's no such thing as a pure hard resource or hard currency because of the dynamics that basically reduce value given a disaster, given a catastrophe. I mean, there's really nothing that holds value. I guess that's why Christ said, put your money in heaven, right? Because if you have your money stored up in earth, there's always something that can come and destroy the value of your treasure. So when we're talking about these rich people, how are they benefiting from this up and down of the market? The market surges and it crashes and surges and crashes. The average person gets wiped out. The small business gets wiped out. Most people get wiped out. But what rich people do is they ride the wave. They ride that curve. There's like a 400% growth in the stock market or something ridiculous. And then the day before everything crashes, they sell all their stock and they invested in something that is semi-recession proof. And so they're not necessarily gaining money during a recession, but they're at least maintaining their value. They're maintaining their wealth. And then when the recession ends, after a few months, after a few years, they invest back in the market, and then it surges again like 400%, 800%. And so they do this over several decades. And while everyone else has been riding up and down, surging and crashing, and basically not making any gains, in fact, losing money in a lot of cases, the rich are just compounding gains on top of gains. And so their growth rate looks like not just 4% or not just 400%, not just 800%, but 16 times, 20 times their wealth a few decades ago. Now they've expanded their wealth by multiples and multiples and multiples. This is really where we get a lot of wealth inequality from. This dynamic of what's essentially insider trading that all rich people do because they have insider information. There's no way to stop insider trading. It's impossible. It's impossible. Everyone's doing it, and there are trillions of dollars to be made in insider trading. So all the bans and injunctions and the people who went to jail back in the 1980s with its, the 1980s had its own financial problems with people like Michael Milken and Ivan Boesky, and these people went to jail, but other people didn't. Carl Icahn didn't go to jail. And there were a whole host of others who didn't go to jail. So you ultimately can't solve the problem of insider trading. What you could theoretically do is you could even out the market. That is, you could stop providing these interest-free loans. You could stop pumping money into the market. You could basically go a libertarian style where instead of providing stimulus packages and creating bull markets, you could just keep a steady market, which is pretty much what North Korea does, right? With a communist command economy, is there's no surging, there's no crashing, the market is just stable. And what that means is that rich people don't have an opportunity to use insider trading to access this wealth inequality, and the majority of people just keep working, and maybe over time they're able to make gains. So I guess that I kind of got off track there from the neoliberalism versus Joker talk. I have been fasting today. I have not been eating, and I am very hungry. Let's see. Camille wants detached engagement, as Timothy Winter calls it. See the lecture, Riding the Tiger of Modernity, Joker-esque neoliberalism. Right. I mean, I believe I did point out that unless you fetishize the masculine or the feminine, most people are going to be a mix of the two types. Most people are going to say, well, there are certain things about the system that are valuable that we should keep, and there's a certain immaturity to just trying to burn everything down. And that's very silly and burns itself out quickly, and people who do that are simply destructive and provide nothing of value. But on the other hand, there are certain things about the system that we could change, that are reasonable to change, and we do have an amount of freedom within this system to improve things. So that's why I use this term minoritarian, because I think we cannot change the system as a whole. So that's the way in which I'm a neoliberal. I believe in the status quo. We cannot change the system as a whole, but we can create systems within the system, minority communities, which can change, which can develop new ways or rediscover old ways of thinking and doing things that are going to be little rebellions against the system, but not trying to destroy the system, because we understand the reality of the situation. The same way the peasants, there's no such thing as a successful peasant revolt. Feudal Europe if someone came up to you in feudal Europe and said, we're going to cut the head off the king, join me, we're going to form a people's crusade. The People's Crusade, silly and failed. Ultimately, there was a inequality of power in feudal Europe that made it impossible to rebel. But there were small little rebellions that minoritarian groups made. The Cathars, the alchemists, esotericists, occultists. They were able to make enough gains to ultimately lead to things like the Renaissance, and to ultimately lead to things like the Enlightenment. And so you were able to produce change over time, not by full-on confronting the system, declaring war against the system, but people were ultimately able to make change by creating little communities, esoteric cults that wanted to see change within themselves before they changed the world. So there is a compromise to this. I don't think, obviously, just sitting back and saying everything is fine while the world burns around you is pretty unreasonable. At the same time, declaring yourself the king and saying that everything is going to change the way I want it to, and just completely disregarding the anti-fragility of the system and just making bold declarations. We've seen a lot of that, right? We've seen a lot of declarations of war. And we've seen neoliberalism develop for a very long time, and we've seen its opponents. We've seen the people who have tried to destroy it and who have tried to act out against it. We've seen the way that they failed, and they made quite a show of it, and they were quite fantastical about it during World War II and afterwards. They'll dress up in costumes and uniforms, and they'll sort of shout expletives, and there might be violent and skinheads and all kinds of Joker types. But ultimately, we see the limitations of that. And to me, there's something disgusting about that. There's something deceptive about that. The type of person who cares more about their own personal moral victory, their internal declaration of war against the world. There's something disgusting and deceptive to me about that, because it's fake and it's false and it doesn't produce real change. So I would probably agree that being at one extreme or the other is not satisfactory. It's not sufficient to me. And we just have to be aware of the fetishists who want to go one way or the other, and instead of acting intelligently. August Aghast says, many of the most powerful American industrialists of the early 20th century amassed their wealth through calculated gambles during war and crisis. That's very true. World War I is a great example of all of these different companies they got all of their wealth through war profiteering. There have been various jokers throughout history, many iterations of neoliberalism as well. I agree with that because this is fundamentally about the status quo versus the rebel. And I think fully embracing one on a moralistic level, completely regardless of the consequences, regardless of the evidence, defending the system and everything about the system, we know what that personality looks like. We know who the type of person who does that. We know that it's not based on rationality or reasonability. We know it's just simply a desire for safety and comfort and familiarity. And we see the ways in which it is not sufficient. But also, we can point out the ways in which the Joker is insufficient, that the Joker promises revolutionary change and then oftentimes sucks up people's energy, especially young people, get fascinated by these promises of change, get sucked into these sort of things, and actually end up being scapegoats that are necessary for the system to perpetuate itself. So that presents problems of its own. I think that's pretty much all I had to say for this one. I think I am going to go eat something, and maybe we'll do some streaming later. Maybe we'll play some chess over on DLive. Maybe we will do some Minecraft. Maybe we will read the Quran. We could do some Quran reading today. We've got a bit of time here, so we could do some Quran reading, but I think I'll put that Quran reading in a separate stream I think it's time to get back into some of those projects, those reading projects that I ran out of time when I was doing the Locke reading. I said, okay, we're going to be done with that for a while. I think it might be time to get back into reading and to learning and investigating and finishing one project so that we can start new projects in the future. So this was a short one, but obviously yesterday we did like a 4-hour stream. I don't want to do that. I know that's my tendency, and so I always have to check my tendencies and biases that make me want to do a 4-hour stream. But really, that's not good. And having some discipline about the timing is good. So we'll play the outro. I forgot to do that last time. It's habits. Eventually, I'll get there. I'll make 1,000 mistakes in order to finally get it right. But we'll play the outro, and I will probably see you later today. Until then, bye-bye.